Coming into the township of Crowlestad with the road running above the beach, the story that we're going to set there is about old soldiers of this township. If you take the first turning on your right, above you on the left is the ruin of a black house. And this is the house where one of the old soldiers of Uig lived who had come back from being away fighting in the Napoleonic Wars. This location takes us back to the Napoleonic Wars. Seaforth owned Lewis at that time, and different Seaforths used to come to enlist boys to the army. One of the latest waves of recruitment happened in 1804, when Seaforth was again recruiting to go to the Napoleonic Wars. And there was some resistance, as there often was, to taking another wave of young boys away to unknown wars. So what happened is that he linked with the minister of the time, Hugh Munro, who had a young son who was a young man then, John. John volunteered to become the ensign, an officer, and to become an ensign in a regiment you had to recruit 20 soldiers to go with you. So the 1804 band who left Uig were known as the soldiers of the son of the minister, Saijad and Vikivinishjar. They must have been very young, because when they were first seen on parade in Italy on the way out to Egypt, a senior officer is supposed to have said, "I sent for soldiers, not for boys." But then, in the first serious engagement they had at Maida, they fought so impressively that he said how wrong he had been to judge them as boys. Regiment crossed the Mediterranean into Egypt, and the ones who left from here found themselves in a particularly deadly battle that happened, where they were cornered at the Battle of El Hamad in 1807. 800 or so were caught in a trap. The officers formed them into a square, and the square was getting smaller and smaller and smaller as they were enclosed on four sides, until they had lost hundreds of men before the white flags of surrender went up. And the Turks, for it was the Turks they were against then, the Turks were in league with Napoleonic forces, had a habit of beheading the dead and even the wounded. And there were some gruesome tales of what boys from here saw happening. It said they had to walk between two sets of poles on which the heads of their late friends was placed. A whole number of them were enslaved and spent years among the Turks, and some of them in fact returned after 7 years of being enslaved. To add to their injury, at that time ophthalmia was raging among the British troops, and of course a number of lads from here were blinded by ophthalmia. Those who were affected came back here. They had £30 a year soldier's pension, and they had £12 for a guide to lead them. They were well off. They had high status when they returned, but not all of them returned. Some of the ones who had survived were then set off, still with the minister's son leading them, and they ended up in terrible battles in Java. And in fact in Java, John Munro was killed, and it was said here that they used to say of the fellow who assailed and killed him, "We set upon him with our bayonets till there was hardly enough left of him that would bait a long line." The stories of these old soldiers carried on for a long time, those who hadn't come back and those who did come back. They were more worldly wise and had seen the horrors of war, and they came back here to very changing times. The land was being changed so that people were taken off their croft and made to move to other parts of the island or to move overseas. A new form of religion was arriving. There are stories of a minister in the church when the soldiers were older, referring to the Turks as our friends because they were on the British side in the Battle of the Crimea. And it said that one of the old soldiers stood up and said, "You don't know what you're talking about. Had you seen what the Turks did to many a lad from this district of Uig at El Hamid, you wouldn't call them our friends." One of the men who returned back, whose house, the ruins of the houses in this village of Crowlista, had been injured with a bullet through his cheek. And his discharge papers say discharged because of infection of a wound to his jaw in Java. It said of him that he was once having an argument with his wife, and he said, "I've been to Upper Egypt, I've been to Lower Egypt, and I never saw your like." Another of the Uig soldiers became a very religious man and was a poet, and he said in his poem, "At El Hamid, the enemy descended on us like high tide, and many a fine lad was